cameras. So talking about how to cut miters on the table saw, and these are specific miters, not necessarily for small frames or anything like that. These are for Carcass miters, so slightly wider material, possibly really long material for what it is you're doing. It requires a little bit of special setup, but once you know that it exists, it's a breeze, and you'll probably lean towards doing it this way for miters you need to do in the future. Alright, so if I had a narrow piece to run a miter, I would probably use a sled similar to this one. So this is a dedicated sled, just cuts 45 degrees, and I've done setups with these things a ton, and these are good. Two problems that exist here. Number one is if this sled were wider, I could do all of my miters with this sled, and these are for deeper cabinets. We're talking about anything greater than whatever my sled is set to. This is about 9 inches. So that's not a lot of material. The other problem with this setup is going to be the length that I have to use here. So if I'm doing a really small piece, then I can set up a stop over here, clamp that down, and then I can make this work. Bigger concern here is when I start getting into pieces that need to be longer than this sled will accommodate, then I need to set up a special kind of stop. I have this board here, has this little section cut out. This is not necessarily a square. This edge is okay, but it's not a pretty cut. So what I've done with this is you could extend this thing over, and I can make this as long as I need to, and measure outside end here to where the blade is, and then I can clamp this thing down and I can start chopping these things out by the hundreds. So this is a really simple way to extend the length of your sled should you need to. I'm not really in a situation where I could extend the width of this sled for cutting miters, so I need to be creative, and that's where this other process comes into play. So getting rid of this sled, the first thing that I've done obviously is tilting the blade on my saw at 45 degrees. It's always a great idea to do a test cut here, test this one, and then check with a square. Ideally, if I were doing a bunch of these, I would rip this edge, bring the fence over, rip this edge all the way through, flip it around, flip it over, rip this all the way through so that the miters go into what will be the center here. So all the points are sharp points are pointing out, all of the narrow points are in, and once I've done that, then I can start cutting this down into lengths. Kind of doesn't matter, but once I've tried miters on both sides, tape this together all the way around, and if I can hold this box together without having it rack or wiggle, then I know that I'm right at 90 degrees. So I've already done that. I probably should have done that off camera, or on camera. The setup that I'm trying to do for large Carcass stuff is close to what it is I need to do. So once I have this set up, and I have this material that I need to put miters on, it's kind of a problem because if I would use the fence, I'm in this situation which is really unsafe. It's concerning for me because the longest edge of the material, or the longest section of the material, is here, unsupported. I have this end grain against the fence. If I were to cut this thing through, and if I could do that safely, that's probably not a bad idea. Then flipping this thing around, then I run into a problem where now I have this razor's edge that I've created that has a tendency of wedging itself underneath the fence. And so going along just fine. If that starts to jam there, and it always starts jamming there, then I have this situation where I'm going to start to pinch or bind the blade, and that's terrifying. I don't want to get anywhere near that situation. So I don't love this setup for obvious reasons. The other thing is, if I were to bring this material closer to the fence, and I'm closer to the setup that I need, but this is still not ideal because there's nothing to reference off of these. And if I used maybe a sled that just goes into this one side of the tracks, maybe a miter gauge in here, assuming that it was large enough to support this work. Probably could do this. At that point, I don't need the fence anymore, but I really don't like this thing going through, because usually in the miter track, it's just a narrow section. Even if you put an auxiliary fence here, it's just not enough stout material. It's not enough rigidity to make this thing happen. So instead of that, I'm going to show you a better way to do it, I think, that requires a little bit of setup, but it's totally worth it in the long run. So first things first, as you saw, I have a right tilt blade, and that means for this setup I'm going to leave the fence on this side to the right of the blade. If I had a left tilt, then I would do something that most woodworkers rarely do, which is move the fence to the left side of the blade. But for this, it has got to stay on the right hand side. Okay, so I've got that. What I want to do now, lay this board touching the fence, and then I'm going to get this piece. Doesn't matter what it is, doesn't matter the thickness. What does matter is it has a straight edge on the bottom and consistent thickness. If I've got this, I could use plywood, I could use MDF, I could use whatever, but it's got to be nice and true, otherwise this process becomes much more complicated. And then from there, I'll clamp it in a couple of places. Okay. So right now, this board is kind of squarely wedged in underneath. I need to modify this setup slightly. And what I need to do is pull this piece out and then start to lower this auxiliary fence that I've created. If I've done this low enough, this board will jam into this auxiliary fence. It will not go underneath. I haven't touched this outside edge, so I need to do the same over here. That looks pretty good. Alright. So all the way across, making good contact with this auxiliary fence. The next thing I need to do, I'm going to move the camera and reposition so I can show you exactly what I'm up to. Alright, so looking down here, this is kind of the critical element. So what I'm going to be doing, raising up the blade. Now I'm going to use this board as my reference, and I know that I need to have these teeth above the thickness of this board. So this one is about there. But this board needs to be on the right hand side to really see where those teeth are in relationship to the thickness of this board. So what I'm going to do instead is pull this fence over. And you can see, I hope, yeah, you can see a bit of a better example of this reference for dialing this thing in. So what I'm going to try to do here is, again, this board is just a little bit thicker than the bottom edge of this auxiliary fence. So what I'll do is I'll start to turn the saw on, bring the blade over into that auxiliary fence. But I want to start the blade much lower than I think I need, and then pull this over so that now the outside of the tooth is going to be making a very, very subtle cut on the outside of this fence. I probably should have mentioned this earlier. My saw does not have a riving knife. If yours does, it's probably going to get in the way for this process, so I would have pulled this thing out before I tilted the blade, but I'm so used to not doing it. Okay, so let me show you what this looks like. Sorry again for the jiggly camera. Okay. That looks pretty close. So I'm just sighting down the face of this board, looking for the edge of that tooth of the blade, getting rid of this material because I don't need it until I'm ready to start cutting. Alright, turning it on. So what I've done, which you might have seen, is obviously turn the blade on, raise the blade up a little bit until I was cutting onto the bottom edge of this board. And then because I don't want that blade to engage in anywhere else on this cut except for the outside edges of this tooth, then I lower the blade just a little bit. So at this point, this is kind of the setup that I think I want to try. So I'll turn the saw back on and start making this cut. Holding down, holding into the fence the whole time. So if you notice, what is left behind on the saw here is one of the bigger benefits of this process, that any waste pieces here are not going to get jammed between the spinning blade and the fence. They find a home underneath this auxiliary fence here, and they stay safely out of the way until I'm ready to move them. Alright, now looking at the part we care about, we've got a decent miter going across here. Sorry. But I can tell, pardon me, I can see that I have a flat spot here still, which is fine. I can always take more of this material off. I'm going to try to refocus one more time here. The benefit of this setup is that I can revisit this final dimension with my miter because I've already cut this material to the final length. It has to be done for this method. I have to square it, I have to cut it down to its final length, and if I've done that, then I can start truing these things up. And I've got about, that's an eighth of an inch to work with here to start adjusting. I'll pull this out just a bit. Okay, so 1/8 of an inch here on the top. I don't want to move my fence over here. That's just going to increase that flat spot. So I need to move it over to my right, which means lower the blade. I don't want any part of this blade engaged into the kerf that's being created underneath here. So lowering the blade, then moving it over about 1/8. I'm going to be fairly cautious when I move this over and start approaching the cut. So I've adjusted this, turning the saw back on, raising the blade back up, and I like what I saw right there. I like that the blade, I can see, was cutting outside of the face here. I told you I'm awfully close. So I'm trying to focus in on the good stuff, which I can't do from there. Yeah, there we go. Alright, so what you couldn't see before is that I have a nice crisp line all the way across without cutting into the overall length of the piece. So this is pretty fantastic. Sighting it down this way, if I can do that. That looks like the miter that I'm hopefully after. Yeah, sorry about the focus. But I've come to a nice point here. I forget what my final length was that I wanted, but oh yeah, good. So I'm right on, which is great. So now at this point, now that this piece is being cut to final, cut to final length, all I need to do is pull this back out, flip this around, and then I'll cut the other end, and I'm ready to go. So a couple things to consider when using this operation. I usually can see from right here as I start cutting after I move the fence over, if this blade is starting to cut a little bit. Let me see if I can do this better. Right when that blade engages in the cut, right about there, I know I'm in trouble if I see the blade coming through and starting to cut on the face of this board. If I've done that, then I can see that I'm changing the overall length of the piece, and then my material is going to be shorter than I need. So that's a good warning sign to notice, and I'll notice it before I go into the full cut. So I can easily engage in this cut, and then I start to see that, pull it back out, and then I can readdress this thing, hopefully by not sacrificing that corner. So the other thing to be thoughtful of or mindful of when using this operation is that if this is going to be for a wooden carcass, maybe I'll have a divider in here, maybe there's going to be something else that I need to consider a specific location for. I start getting into some real trouble when it comes to measuring this thing off, because I'm hooking a tape and material that really doesn't exist any longer. Sorry, let me see if I can pull this out. There we go. So hooking a tape over here becomes a problem because there's just no easy way to get involved with this. Even if I use a rigid ruler or doing this first inch trick and pulling in from here to there, it becomes problematic. It's just not as accurate and repeatable as I think I would like. So if you do have a carcass that you're going to be building, I would strongly recommend cutting this piece down to its final length, leaving the ends square. At that point, I can start to lock in and dial in, mark out where it is I need to cut, sliding dovetail, a dado, or whatever, maybe a series of mortises, leaving these things square. The benefit of this is that I can always leave it to the final length, and once it's done, once it's trued up, ends are squared, do all of my interior joinery, and then bring it back to the table saw for this final step, and then you're in good shape. Before I sign off, there's always a little bit of confusion about dimensions of these pieces. So I want to talk a little bit about this piece. So there's an old adage, and I don't know if I fully embrace the idea, but they say that end grain should never make contact with the fence here. In essence, that's exactly what I did a second ago, but I did it wrong. I put the end grain towards this setup because I have to. The other thing here is just making sure this dimension is going to be safe to run through the saw. And so I have all of this material obviously resting on the bed. I've got this length engaging into the fence. So I can get away with cutting this end and this end very safely using this exact setup. There's really nowhere for this material to start jamming or binding into the blade, which is an important consideration. If this thing starts to come away from the fence here, that's when you know you're going to start getting kickback. But for this thing, all of this material is going to be protected on this part. The waste piece drops down below. As you can see, I've got a couple pieces in there. I would just keep going through all of these parts until those just kind of self-clear, and once I've done that, then I'm set, and then I'm ready to start going on to the next stages. One last thing to talk about for miters is that inside of the miter we talk a lot about different joinery. Let's see if I can do this. There we go. So if I wanted to cut a spline into this environment, I can cut all the way across using this setup, but in a different orientation. So I can cut a spline all the way through. If I didn't want to do that, I can do biscuits in this area. I can do dominoes in here. I can do any number of options for doing this and making this miter joint stronger. If I did want to lean towards or introduce a spline here, immediately after